Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
The APS is not historically large at all, but by continually saying we will get rid of those 36,000 Canberra-based public servants, there's been given a really strong impression that all those new jobs have been in Canberra, and that's just not the case.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute. We begin across the Pacific where Elon Musk is ripping through the US federal government.
Right, well, we just basically follow the money.
Elon's a very special person, and these cabinet people are special people.
They're saying one thing and doing another. And you ask me how I'm doing, I'm pissed off because it's like every day we're getting another body blow to the soul of America. And here we have not even a public announcement, but a leaked memo that the new VA secretary, who's a pretty radical guy, is now going to lay off 83,000 people at the VA. 25% of them are veterans.
In just under 2 months in his role as head of Department of Government Efficiency, embarrassingly known as DOGE, tens of thousands of public servants have been laid off and key government programs have been paused or terminated. And the public sector is under fire here in Australia too.
And would you cut spending?
Well, where we see wasteful spending, yes, we would. And putting an additional 36,000 public servants into Canberra at a cost of over $6 billion a year recurring expenditure. It's a recipe to try and please the unions, not to try and drive government efficiency.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton says if elected, he'll end working from home arrangements for public servants and claims he'll fund key election promises by cutting as many as 36,000 public service jobs. But will making the public service smaller actually make it more efficient or save a single cent? Joining me today to talk about the attacks on the public sector and some recent Australia Institute research is Dr. Fiona Macdonald, Acting Director for the Centre for Future Work here at the Australia Institute. G'day, Fiona. Thanks for joining us.
G'day, Glenn. Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start with crazy Elon and his DOGE team. They're taking a real slash and burn approach, demanding access to sensitive data. They're trying to dramatically reduce the size of the US government. Now, we've seen him on stage waving the chainsaw around, but what impact are his changes having in homes and, more importantly, in workplaces in the US?
Well, I think we're seeing those changes rolling out really quickly and, too fast for us to kind of keep up with. If you think about the homes of those people who might be losing their jobs, that's potentially up to 300 to 400,000 people for a start. That's direct public servants who might be losing their jobs or federal government workers. Then there are potentially for every one of those, there's apparently, I've seen estimates of up to 2 private contractors who might be directly affected and their families be affected through job losses. We're starting to see that having a bigger impact with the unemployment rate has just gone up 0.1%. But I would think that the fear in households and workplaces is much broader than that. The threats to wind back diversity, equity and inclusion programs will have an impact in workplaces. They'll have an impact on individuals. The job losses will disproportionately impact on some cities and regions. So I'm not on the ground there, but I think that there's probably a lot of fear as this is going ahead because of the ripple effects that I'm not even touching, but the ripple effects in communities and families of cutting back on the services as well as cutting back on directly on the jobs. But you can't produce the same outputs and you can't produce service delivery outcomes if you have lost lots of back office people. I think there's this kind of myth that don't touch frontline service jobs and everything will be fine, that everybody in the back office doesn't contribute. Those jobs at the front line don't work without those back office jobs. So I think we're still to see many of the impacts, but I think people must be feeling quite fearful.
And I mentioned that it's all happened in under 2 months and used the phrase slash and burn. Is one of the problems here that it's been rushed and done so quickly? You would imagine if you're going to take away hundreds of thousands of people's livelihoods, you would do so at least in a planned and clinical manner.
Yes, you would think that to do that effectively, if it was going to be of any use or create any efficiencies, you'd need to actually really be clear on where those inefficiencies were in the first place. And you would need to be very careful about how you did this. It is very much, as you say, a slash and burn exercise that will have all sorts of unintended consequences. I think I read somewhere that, in some departments, the remaining staff have been given chatbots to assist them do their jobs, and they're just finding that those are not effective, not fit for purpose, and are actually making things more difficult. So, yes, it does seem totally actually kind of out of control. It's hard to see any clear plan. It's clearly an ideological shift about the public service as much as it is about saving money, and it's not happening in any logical way.
I'm also very pleased today to announce that Jacinta Price, who has done an amazing body of work in Indigenous affairs, so she will take on the important role of Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency. There is a lot of waste that's been generated over the course of the last 2.5 years, $6 billion a year spent on 36,000 new public servants in Canberra. That is of no assistance whatsoever to the people of Cairns and the people of regional communities who want additional investment.
Fiona, we'd never suggest what's happening in Trump's America could happen on the same scale here, but Peter Dutton has appointed Jacinta Price in a Musk-type role, shadow government efficiency minister, to crack down on wasteful spending. You wouldn't anticipate seeing anything like what's happening in America here under a Dutton government, would you?
Well, Glenn, I would hope we wouldn't see anything like what's happening in the US happening here under a Dutton government, but there are echoes very much in the opposition leaders' moves. The naming the new department or office or whatever as the Office of Government Efficiency is very much playing to Trump's, echoing Trump's playbook, as is some mentions of removing diversity and equity and inclusion programs. So I think we do need to be a little concerned. There is a longer standing interest and desire within the coalition to, a dislike of the public services, I suppose. Under the Abbott government, there was a cap placed on staffing in the federal public service that in 2015-16 that took, capped numbers back to like 2011-12 numbers, regardless of what was needed. So there is a kind of ideological underpinnings that the public service is either wasteful or is not efficient generally, and could, programs and services are better provided in the private sector. So there is also a bit of a sense that the idea that 36,000 new public servants were put on under the Albanese government in the last couple of years, and that those are the numbers that need to go, and the insistence that Peter Dutton keeps having that those jobs are in Canberra, when in fact we know that most of those jobs actually aren't in Canberra. So I'm sure there must be waste somewhere, but there's waste everywhere, I think, in all sorts of organisations. And I don't think that these indications of what's going to happen with this Office of Government Efficiency led by Jacinta Price are actually underpinned by any real knowledge of any or evidence of any waste.
So let's then fast forward and imagine Peter Dutton has been elected in a month or two. How quickly could those 36,000 jobs go? And if that were to happen, what happens to those roles and how does the government operate, given we have such complex systems and growing systems like the NDIS and our welfare systems?
The Centre for Future Work has had a look at what happened when the Abbott government's staffing cap was on, and our senior researcher Lisa Heap had a really close look at that. And if we take that as an indication of what might happen, first of all, what might happen within the public service is we're likely to see that as employee numbers go down, private contractor numbers go up. And we know that there are lots of examples where that has not actually been in any way efficient or effective. It's cost more and service delivery outcomes have been poorer. So first off, I think I'm saying that the idea that you get your staffing numbers down doesn't actually mean that you really do save any money at all or make a more efficient public service. Then, of course, there are the issues, really serious issues about what happens to the work that the service does. And you mentioned the NDIS. That's a really good one because we've just had a Royal Commission into disability. We've had reviews of the NDIS. And what's really clear there is the absence of proper resourcing of those back office jobs that actually oversee what's happening in what is effectively a kind of privatised services sector, the NDIS. But those public servants who work in compliance, in quality, and those that actually keep an eye on what's going on and make sure that quality standards are being upheld and make sure that the system is not being ripped off, which it was. By a lot, there were lots of places, there's millions of dollars involved in that. So those public service jobs are actually saving money. They're ensuring that services are good quality and they're ensuring that services get where they're meant to get. And these are not frontline jobs, these are back office jobs.
Okay, so we can talk about quality and integrity in a moment, but let's go back to the headcounts and dollars and cents. So if 36,000 public servants are put off, would we expect 36,000 consultants to come on, and would that be a similar dollar for dollar cost?
No, I think what we know from recent experience is that cost could be anything like, it might vary enormously depending on what the roles are. But in some places where we've seen supposedly cheaper, efficient labour hire used, they're actually costing more than, there was something, I think it's in Department of Veterans Affairs, costing something more than 30% more to provide the same services that were being provided by staff. So that's more expensive and service quality, like service delivery outcomes weren't as good. Then in other areas of policy development, we've seen those scandals of $1 million paid for basically very little, I think, for a PowerPoint presentation, lots and lots of involvement of external expensive consultants from consultancy firms. Again, so in terms of money, no, there's no real evidence to show that if you cut those 36,000 jobs, even particularly as we don't know what they are, if they're cut in a kind of way that the Trump government is operating, or even if they're cut by targeting, as I suggested before, say compliance jobs or diversity, equity and inclusion programs that actually support, all sorts of people to participate economically when that mightn't have been the case. There's no necessary savings.
Okay, so there were obviously some high-profile integrity issues with sensitive information given by consultants to third parties. But you mentioned quality of services. What do we know about cutting public service jobs, replacing them with consultants? What does that do to the quality of the work for the people that access these services?
Well, the information that we have about some direct service outcomes, service delivery outcomes that we've seen change with the bringing some public servants back in, putting extra public servants on, and bringing some services back directly, replacing contracted out labour with public service labour, is we've seen, and the report that I was talking about before that our researcher Lisa Heap wrote, we have seen some significant changes in terms of waiting times in customer service centres that would, some of them were, the differences were down from 25 minutes waiting to 9 minutes waiting in either Services Australia or the Department of Veterans Affairs. And in claims processing, people waiting months for claims to be processed so that they can get income support or get counselling or get, whatever service it is that might be absolutely vital to their well-being. We've seen some really significant changes, improvements in those. And so it does make a big difference to people's lives.
So there's long been an argument that the private sector can do things better or more efficiently. But even if you were to move public sector jobs over to the private sector, there's got to be a transition period before that could happen as well, you would imagine. I mean, is it real, this concept that private does it better?
Well, there's not actually a great deal of evidence to suggest that, but that's a kind of a 30-year, a long-held belief by many people. It started in the late 1980s, this idea that the government shouldn't be providing services because it was somehow inefficient, and the idea being that if you were in a private market, and the competitive pressures would lead to more efficient services, and consumers, citizens would be able to identify the best services through that competition, through their individual consumer choice, and we would end up with much better services, whereas the public service had kind of captured, if a government provided service, people have no choice, there's no competitive pressure to improve the services. Now, that's not how it's played out at all. None of these markets are the kind of mythical or hypothetical perfect competitive markets where people have choices. If you're a person with a disability living in a small country town and you have a significant disability, you and your family potentially will really struggle to find services if we rely on private providers who need to make profit to choose to go there and provide you with a service. That's not how it works. We've seen that happen with the privatisation of employment services for unemployed people, and we've seen it happen in aged care. We've seen it happen. We've seen it happening in a really significant ways in early childhood education and care, where private providers don't go where they can't make a profit, and so we have such things as childcare deserts. Because why would you take your business there if you can't make a profit? So, lots of government services are provided don't make profits. And once we put the profit imperative into it, it's really difficult to actually ensure any kind of equitable service and universal access to those services, let alone the question of whether or not an actual private sector organisation might be more efficient than a public service one, which, again, as I said, there's not any great deal of evidence to suggest, that's the case. There's some intrinsic idea of market competition makes that the case, but there's so many reasons why private providers can't necessarily provide the services that the Australian community needs and expects, and we have a commitment to provide to them.
There's never a dull moment in the Canberra bubble, is there?
You fail to understand that people smugglers don't deal with the nuance of the Canberra bubble.
Yes, I think people are sick of the Canberra bubble, and I think a big problem we have in this country is that government is too big.
So I wonder why then we keep having this debate, whether there's some focus group that's found that, fat cats in Canberra are all lazy and live in a bubble. Is this a rhetorical debate? Is this just pure rhetoric because it's a good line for a politician to wheel out?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it has been for a long time. I wonder now, though, whether it is such. I think that's what it is, what's happening, but whether it's actually working. I think when we think of things like COVID and the pandemic and the recent multiple disasters we've had, the recent flooding, was a cyclone in Queensland and New South Wales, but also bushfires and other disasters. It's voluntary community responses backed up by government services that actually government needs to be there to actually make sure that people are safe, to look after people's well-being, and government mobilises that support. I mean, that's the kind of pointy end of the importance of public services, but they are providing services to the entire community that are essential to people's well-being. So the idea that it's a bunch of fat cats sitting there shuffling papers, I think, it is rhetoric, and I don't know how well it appeals.
You've referenced families with disabled kids in regional Australia. You've referenced recent disasters happening in remote parts of, well, not remote parts, but in Queensland and New South Wales. This concept that so much of the public service is just sitting in comfortable offices in Canberra, is that characterisation remotely fair?
There is a large public service in Canberra, but it's, most public servants are not in Canberra. And the majority of the growth, actually, with the additional 36,000 people over the last few years, has not been in Canberra. It's been in Queensland, it's been in Northern Territory, it's been in regional New South Wales, it's been, the Queensland is the one that I think is most significant. But there are, a large part of our public service is centralised, but it is certainly not the case that that's where most public servants are at all. And in many ways, it makes a lot of sense for some of those public servants to be there. That there's been some experiments with moving big departments out to regions. That hasn't necessarily worked, particularly because you don't end up with the right expertise. There's a kind of collective capital of good, qualified, experienced public servants in one place. But seriously, that's not where they all are, no.
Let's talk about working from home. The Coalition has vowed to end working from home for public servants if they're elected at the federal election. Who would suffer then? What impact would that have on the workforce?
Well, working from home is immensely valuable to many people for multiple reasons. The groups who are very readily identified, I think, are women who bear the majority of the responsibility for childcare, but also any working parents who rely on working from home to get the flexibility they need to either work or to work full-time. And we've seen women's full-time participation go up since the COVID pandemic. And we also know at the same time that women with children are the group who really value work from home more than anyone else. So we can see that in fact could be having not just that beneficial effect for individuals, but a beneficial effect across the economy for economic, for participation. And the same goes for, we've seen really big increases between 2018 and 2022 in employment of people with disability who have an impairment that is a barrier to them working. So I would think that we will see that working from home, I don't think there's any surveys out there yet that have kind of tied that directly to working from home, but we know that people with disability who have mobility problems, we know they're one of the groups who say that working from home is really important. So again, that's not only benefits for individuals, but it's really massive benefits. It's been so difficult to make inroads into unemployment and lack of labour force participation of people with disability over decades and decades, which has got as much to do with our society's inability to accommodate difference and accommodate people's specific needs. And if we can see changes in that, that's a massive economic boost to have all those people who previously were locked out of the labour market and locked out of the labour force working. So those are some of the benefits.
So are we again just back to political talking points here? A politician stands in the middle of Melbourne and Sydney and says, I'm going to bring the people back to revitalise the city. Heaven forbid the traffic problems that might cause. Is it again just characterising public servants working from home as lazy or, clicking on their computer once an hour or whatever, going to the golf course? Just, again, unfounded political talking points.
I think a lot of it is, yeah. And I think very much, they can see that's what's happening. It's just a dislike. That's what's happening in the US. That's pretty clear. It's a dislike of people not being there under control. There are also, there are lots of good business reasons that people that might be preferred to be back in the office. But while they're good reasons, they're all reasons that, aren't critical. If you've got good management, good engagement always beats location. The research shows that if you can engage your workers really well, it doesn't matter so much where they're working. So I think a lot of it is rhetoric. There are various interests also. There are the interests of the big. If we're talking about private companies, the big companies, or even the public service, if you've got a whole heap of unused real estate in buildings, there's an interest in seeing that used. So while there are lots of different reasons, while you might want workers back in the office, I think there's a pretty big political, ideological kind of trying to actually perhaps create the impression that this is wasteful. All these public servants are not doing their jobs properly and being wasteful and being lazy by putting out the idea that if they're not in the office, they're not doing their jobs properly, which is kind of what the opposition leader's been saying. He talks about people not wanting to come into work and the people who have refused to come back. And I think, there might have been an anecdote of somebody raised in a Senate estimates hearing, but there's no evidence that I'm familiar with, and I've not heard anybody talk about there being evidence of people just refusing to come to work and undermining workplace efficiency because they're not there in the public service. So I think, yes, a lot of it is just trying to build an idea that this is a sensible thing and that public servants, we shouldn't be spending money on the public sector. As I said, it's a long-standing dislike of a large public service.
So trying to make people dislike public servants and using this sort of rhetoric and, talking about jealousies or whatever it might be, you alluded to this earlier. Do you think the Australian public are onto this? They're a bit smarter than political one-liners?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's kind of, it's disturbing. They are smarter, but it's that repeat. It may have an impact. Peter Dutton keeps saying 36,000 Canberra-based public servants when we know that most of the 36 additional public servants, which, by the way, the APS is not historically large at all. The number of employed public servants, federal public servants per head of population, is smaller than it was in 2008. After John Howard had been in government. So we're not looking at a massively bloated public service by any count. But by continually saying we will get rid of those 36,000 Canberra-based public servants, there's been given a really strong impression that all those new jobs have been in Canberra, and that's just not the case. We know that's not the case, but it doesn't matter how often other people seem to be saying that's not the case. Peter Dutton is still saying those 36,000 Canberra-based public servants. So, yeah, while I think the public is smart, I think the public shouldn't be subjected to the constant barrage of misinformation.
Yeah.
Because it undermines, that's where we get undermining of trust in what politicians say.
Is the public service becoming part of the culture wars? This idea that he would get rid of diversity and inclusion plans, which have, brought the workforce so far in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, very much so. That's difficult to see that that's anything but that play into culture wars. Because it really doesn't make any sense. The way that Donald Trump is putting this is that diversity, equity and inclusion programs are about discriminating against people, whereas in fact what they're about is eliminating discrimination. So in Peter Dutton following that line, I think has to be seen a bit as playing into that kind of rhetoric, which is really disappointing. Because, as you say, we've seen great inroads being made. We've seen, diversity, equity and inclusion programs are about opportunity. They're about people's well-being. They're about having workplaces where people don't end up having, enormous stress and mental health problems. And then, there's no economic efficiency in that. If massive workers' compensation bills, as well as the damage it does to individuals. Inclusive workplaces are workplaces that welcome all sorts of different people and also that build capability through having a diversity. And there are still, many private sector large business leaders will talk about the benefits, the real benefits that they've seen through these programs. So, yeah, it is about the culture wars. I think it's got to be seen as that.
So just to wrap this whole political argument behind cutting the public service up, what should Australians be demanding in the lead up to the election? Should they be demanding, show us exactly where you're going to make these cuts? Show us what services will be affected. Show us where you'll make these savings. Do you anticipate you would get any of that detail before we go to the polls?
I suspect possibly not, but I suspect if we do get the detail, it'll be offered in a way that, is hopefully, well, it's a bit like cutting the diversity, equity and inclusion programs. I think there's a hope there that will appeal to a particular group of people. So it'll hit some sweet spot where it might benefit. So we might get more detail, but again, whether it's real detail, whether it's sensible detail, I think that's the thing we need to look out for. Sometimes I think if we look at what Donald Trump's been doing and the DOGE story, there's a lot of talk about cutting back office, compliance and, things that sound to people like they're not actually very effective or doing anything, but they're actually the things that we need to keep integrity in our systems, the things we need to stop waste in our systems. But that's not immediately apparent to people. It sounds good. It sounds like these people might be pen pushers doing nothing. So we don't want to hear that kind of detail because it's just potentially fairly meaningless and just building up that idea that it's waste.
So to wrap up this conversation as we look ahead to an election and one side promising to cut the public service, can you wrap up the research that you and Lisa and your team have done and what it's taught us about this debate as I say, as we go into a federal election campaign?
Well, I think one of the main things that it's taught us, in looking to see where are the new public servants, where are the extra public servants, where were they before, what happened when we had staffing gaps and how we saw consultants and contractors come in and the fact that didn't save money and didn't necessarily result in better quality anything. And certainly there were several scandals and problems as a result of outsourcing labour. It's confirmed for us that it is really important to have a well-resourced and independent public service that is not politicised, and that's absolutely critical. And that means having good processes. It means keeping things like diversity and inclusion programs. It means keeping compliance. It means keeping oversight. Offices like the audit functions are absolutely critical. And they also, when we look at what the public service does and all the varieties of services that are provided that are essential to people and the economic benefits that come out of that, we should be supporting a really strong public service, a strong independent public service.
And telling the truth about it every now and then.
Yes, and that would help enormously. Yeah.
Great to talk to you. Thanks so much, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn.
You can read more about our research on restoring public service capability via the link in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today. You can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on social media. We're at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky and at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.